The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents International Focus, a weekly discussion of the people and events behind today's global headlines. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now here's your host, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus. In late 2015, the Colombian government and representatives of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, reached an agreement on transitional justice that paves the way towards the settlement of a conflict that has claimed 220,000 lives and displaced more than 6 million people over the past 5 decades. Our guest today is here to provide a first-hand perspective on that process, as well as some insights into the future of U.S.-Colombian relations. Ramon Escobar serves as Colombia Desk Officer for the U.S. Department of State. He joined the Foreign Service in 2006 and has served in a diverse range of roles covering issues in the Middle East, Europe, and Latin America, including assisting the State Department's Special Envoy to the Colombia Peace Process. Ramon Escobar, welcome to International Focus.
Thank you very much.
And I should say welcome back to Milwaukee. You're
right.
a native son, I understand.
That's right. Grew up on 54th and Bolete.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, I'm wondering if we could just start with a little bit of background, just sort of fast forward through those 50 years of conflict, starting with the period maybe 48-58, the Violencia, as it's known.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really difficult time for Colombia. I mean, to put it in perspective, the current conflict, which has been going on for about 51 years, has seen about 250,000 people killed related to that conflict. La Violencia, which was only roughly about a decade long, saw the same amount of deaths, and obviously had some of the similar underlying reasons for the conflict during La Violencia are still seen today involved in the conflict with the FARC and the ELN and other guerrilla groups, which is a lack of government presence in some of the rural, more external areas of Colombia.
So who were the players in that period, in that early 40s, 50s?
Yeah, well, I mean, I should caveat by saying I'm no historian and I'm not an expert in Colombian history, but my experience and the readings I've done with Colombia, I would say that you had the liberals and the conservative parties, which were the two predominant parties during that time frame. There was a fight for political power that ended up sort of trickling out into the rural areas. And so some of the poor farmers, campesinos, got kind of caught up in the mix of this and sort of became the battleground for this political battleground, but unfortunately came to violence as well. And as the violence increased, communities began arming themselves. And so you had this sort of militia-type fighting. And then ideology got involved. And so eventually, slowly, as La Violencia came to an end in the late 50s, with an agreement, a pact between the conservatives and the liberals to rotate power.
This is the National Front.
The National Front, that's right. Which, as controversial as it may sound to switch power between parties and how orchestrated that sounds, in the moment, I mean, I can imagine 250,000 people dying in 10 years. I think, whatever it took to end the violence, there was at least some public support in the beginning. However, disenfranchisement, right? I mean, people's voices can't be heard. And that's where you see some of these sort of communist parties start to take power and start to gain influence in some of the rural areas where people felt that they couldn't have a political voice.
Well, and if you take that into the wider global context, the idea that there was the perception of communist insurgency or just a communist presence in the Western Hemisphere in the 1950s and early 1960s, that obviously did not look like something Washington was too happy about.
Right. I mean, I'm not too sure about how the United States government was viewing things at that time frame. I wasn't even alive. However, I mean, obviously, the Cuban Revolution was happened during that time frame. There were other instances, yeah, certainly. I mean, the Cold War was in full effect, no doubt.
So there was an articulated Plan Lazo, right, that came out of Washington at that point that was really sort of the U.S.'s prescription for the Colombian government to deal with some of this, isn't there?
I guess so. Like I said, I'm not too familiar with Plan Lazo. I wasn't involved in Colombian U.S. foreign policy at that time, unfortunately.
So talk a little bit about the FARC, and they came from that era. What were the origins there?
Well, I think it had a lot to do with this political violence. So the FARC, were claimed to have represented the poor rural communities who didn't have any. Didn't have access to justice, who didn't have access to the legitimate monopoly of force by the government to protect their interests and their people. In fact, they would often claim that the Colombian government was directly involved in some of the persecution and the persecution of violence against these communities. And so that's where the FARC kind of come from. And they think that, that the Colombian government had never had a presence, a legitimate presence in the areas, in these rural areas, in these poor areas. And so that was how they built their political, legitimacy, I guess, or constituency at that time.
So how do you think that plays into kind of the wider Latin American U.S. context of that era?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, certainly there was, because of the Cold War and because of our policies of containment, there was a certain interest in ensuring that there were democratic values were upheld. And as we saw with time, I mean, the FARC, sure, they may have claimed some as their philosophy or as their concerns or the source of their action, some legitimate concerns that were held among the people. Obviously, the techniques and the tactics they ended up using to try to enforce their vision of what the country should look like were backfired. I mean, today the FARC obviously have about a 3 to 5% approval rating among the Colombian public, and when you start kidnapping people and get into illicit activities, illegal mining, drug trafficking, things like that, you undermine your own sport, and of course extortion. And there were a lot of very public moments when different FARC activities were seen in the public eye and really raised concerns about their actions. So I think that there may have been some legitimate concerns at the beginning, at the inception. However, using these sort of aggressive techniques that alienated large parts of the country, unfortunately, sort of backfired. And so when the U.S. got involved, we were there to help we've always been there on the side of the Colombian government because, maybe the government presence wasn't as strong as it should have been in different areas, but it was still a democratically elected government, and particularly since Pastrana when he started that peace process and Plan Colombia was born, it's been a very, worldwide considered to be an extremely legitimate, democratically elected government with an eye towards building its institutions, democratic institutions.
So let's talk a little bit about that. I've got a quote here from President Pastrana from 1999 in which he was talking about his vision for Plan Colombia. He said, developed countries should help us implement some sort of Marshall Plan for Colombia, which will allow us to develop great investments in the social field in order to offer peasants different alternatives to illicit crops. So it seems very much like there was much more of an emphasis on development. People who were critical of Plan Colombia said it was much more sort of punitive and more of a military incursion. Yeah. So,
unfortunately, that's a misconception that's widely it's just widely said and has been for 15 years now. The reality is that when in 2000, when Plan Colombia was born and conceived, by the way, by Colombians in Bogota, and when the Colombians came to the United States and presented this idea of what needs to be done, it was comprehensive. It was certainly a comprehensive thing. But the original notion was the United States would play one role, and there would be other players too from Europe who would play roles as well. And by the way, the Colombians would play the biggest role right? And we were supporters. All right, in that context, and then you have, domestic political concerns as well, right? You had a Congress that was very much interested in the drug trafficking and the security aspect of it. And then you had the administration who was concerned about, Colombia becoming a failed state. Because back in 2000, this is, today you look at Colombia and you just can't think that 15 years ago it was in such a dire situation. 20,000 FARC guerrillas, they were able to defeat the Colombian military in battalion-sized battles, conventional warfare, able to overrun military, bases, outposts. Today, that the FARC wouldn't have to stand a chance in doing any of those things. So, with that said, in the beginning, the United States saw a plan that was comprehensive, which we supported. There's a focus on heavy spending on the security side in the beginning, but the ultimate, in the beginning, the problem was that there wasn't a government presence. There wasn't the ability for the security forces to go out. That there wasn't a tremendous amount of confidence among the Colombian public in the security forces' ability to defeat the FARC. In fact, at that time, there was a survey that was released where, I think it was in 1999 or maybe it was 2000, where almost 2/3 of the Colombian public supported direct U.S. military intervention. So the confidence in the security forces and their ability to carry out their role was very limited at that time frame. So it made sense that we would focus our efforts in helping build that legitimate security force. One of the key aspects of our initial investment in Plan Colombia was security reform, security sector reform. A lot of the naysayers or the critics at the time said, well, the human rights violations that have been committed by the security, how could you ever support them? Well, what was the alternative? Just ignore security problems and, pretend that they aren't, that you don't need a security force in order to exercise governance in rural areas? That's a non-starter. And so I think that we rightfully focused a big part of our original investment in Plan Colombia in trying to improve the security force, professionalization of the military. Now, this only was possible because President Pastrana at the time recognized this. In fact, before Plan Colombia, he had already started to reform the military, and I think that was one of the reasons why we, the United States at that time, thought that this was a wise investment, because you had a leader in President Pastrana who was had already started that reform process. It was no secret that the Colombian military in that time had some serious human rights concerns. However, you still needed them. They still needed to be a partner in making this, in turning things around in Colombia. And then the other thing that I think is often lost is, in the beginning, part of the problem for the security forces was also lack of mobility. These areas where the FARC were active and were extorting their people and running drugs and kidnapping people, all of these things were happening in areas where the Colombian military literally could not get to, at least quickly enough, in order to effectively carry out operations. And so a big chunk of that initial investment was air mobility, so helicopters and training to use the helicopters and maintenance of helicopters. All these things are big ticket items. They're expensive, so they were front loaded into Plan Colombia. So the price tag is going to look big on the security side, but a lot of that is for something that had to happen. It was uniquely. The United States was one of the only, if you take into account political will, the only country that was positioned to be able to provide that type of assistance. So. I have a hard time understanding the criticism that we were too security focused and Plan Colombia was only a drug plan, because it just wasn't that way. It was about a reform of a whole sector. Not to mention that since the very beginning, there were hundreds of millions of dollars that were invested in alternative development, rule of law, policing. I remember reading through some of the budgets. I'm no longer on the Columbia desk. I'm teaching at Georgetown as a State Department Rusk Fellow, and for 1 year. And one of my classes that I'm teaching is we dove into the history of Colombia a little bit, Plan Colombia in particular, And what's remarkable is the things that people will consider are to be security or the hard side are things that are, in my mind, institution building. For example, training the police force to harden their security perimeters, like basic hard security. That to me, how is that, hard? To me, that's institution building so that the police can now focus their attention on policing, because they don't have to worry about guarding perimeter and spending so many resources and manpower just defending themselves in an isolated, vulnerable post. They've now been able to harden their security, and that's something that the U.S. government spent money on. Another one is demining. That's always lumped into the hard side. Demining, this is so that kids can go and play in the fields and go to school without worrying about being blown up by landmines.
Well, and that's something that people don't necessarily have awareness of, just the extent to which mines are a problem in Colombia.
Right. Yeah.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about the process that yielded this agreement of late last year, but we're going to take a short break first. So we'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. We're discussing the pursuit of peace in Colombia with Ramon Escobar. So you, in your capacity with state at the time, were very much involved in this process. So tell us a little bit about what has been agreed to at this point and what else needs to happen.
Well, I was a special assistant to our special envoy to the peace process from basically when he was selected and then nominated in February of last year until August. And during that time, I would assist him and would attend meetings with him, with the Colombian government, peace negotiators, the FARC guerrillas, and others affiliated with it. And so up until August, I was pretty involved in it. I think one of the main issues that I was a part of was the crisis, the escalation of violence that happened between April and July of last year, where a lot of folks who were watching thought that the peace talks could collapse, and they certainly were vulnerable at that time. And now there's a lot of positive vibes going on, because it looks like that. We're to the point of I can't remember who said it, but somebody in the Colombian government said we're at the point of no return. We're kind of peace is at hand, so long as there's not any sort of surprise factor. But it wasn't always such, and it took a lot of effort from both sides during that time frame to get out of that escalation of violence that started on April 22nd. But I say that because I think that it was a great indicator of how committed both sides are to ending this war. If anybody wanted an out, it was there. With the rapid escalation that was happening in attacks and counterattacks, and so I'm optimistic that I think with the basic agreement on transitional justice that was arrived to in September of last year.
So talk a little bit about what that means exactly.
Yeah, transitional justice is one of the most difficult issues that has faced this peace process, from the U.S. perspective, it's always been this is a decision for the Colombians to decide. We can't be imposed as long as the Colombian government lives up to their international and domestic legal obligations within that framework, within those parameters. It's really up to the Colombians to decide how much justice, right?
So in other words, what becomes of perpetrators of the violence?
Right. So those folks who were involved in the conflict and committed atrocities or committed human rights violations, how are they going to be punished, right? That is the question, and on all sides of the conflict. And that's a tough nut to crack. How many people how many people want to sit at a negotiating table and knowing that they themselves may be held accountable for some type of one of these types of actions? And
so one of the criticisms then of the current agreement is basically it lets perpetrators off too easily. And I think former President Uribe said, for example, it looks like the current administration wants peace at any cost.
Yeah.
How would you respond to that?
Well, my response is simply that, Colombia has been at war for 51 years. There's been a lot of victims. In fact, there's over 6 million people who have been displaced by this violence. I think that there's a lot of resentment towards the FARC, and there's a lot of people who rightfully want to see justice at hand. But in the same token, there are also a lot of people who want to see an end to this violence and don't want any more victims. And they don't want their sons or daughters, particularly those who are still living in conflict zones that are vulnerable, which tend to be poor Afro-Colombians, indigenous people, who may be a little more isolated from the day-to-day and attention of the media. And those folks, I think that their priority is, I just want my kid to live, and I don't want him to be the last victim of this conflict, right? And so I think you have those competing interests that are playing out. And one analogy that I heard was, folks like President Uribe, who are very critical of the Transitional Justice Agreement. I think that one of the analogies that I've heard that has sort of helped me at least come to terms with or better understand where this process might lie and how opinions may change as we get closer and closer to the end and find a peace is think about a beautiful painting, right, an artwork, some classic art, and it's halfway done, all right? Would you buy that painting? Would it be something that's attractive that you put up in your house? Probably not, right? It's unfinished. However, finish painting that, something like the Mona Lisa, something that is really, really beautiful and something that you can appreciate once it's finished. Yeah, I probably would buy it. And I think that's, though analogies are often dangerous territory and they're not always effective, I think in this case that it makes a lot of sense that when peace is at hand and Colombians are given the option of peace or no peace, I think that maybe the transitional justice element that's been agreed to might be sufficient. But that's up to the Colombians to decide, not the United States.
Well, and which Colombians? I noticed there was a movement by, you mentioned the Afro-Colombian segment of the population. Mm-hmm. Some of the entertainers, other very high-profile Afro-Colombian people have said that they haven't had a seat at this table. Do you think that's the case?
I think that the President Santos and the peace negotiators have gone out of their way to bring victims into the process directly, physically. In fact, dozens of victims groups have actually gone to Havana and presented their cases and told their stories. And I'm not I'm not an expert on peace negotiations. It's not something I've studied historically. But from what I understand, that's a pretty novel concept, and to do so deliberately and in a way to where you're trying to affect both parties who are actually negotiating this agreement, I think is commendable. And this is a 51-year conflict. Nobody is going to be perfectly happy with the agreement. I think that is completely understandable. Loss of life, loss of family, loss of relatives. I mean, it's human nature to want your views to be heard, and I think that in this case the Colombian government has done a good job of trying to get everybody's voices at least to the table. Well,
we've just had a visit by President Santos to Washington, and one of the outcomes of that visit was the unveiling of sort of the next step, the sort of successor to Plan Colombia, which is Paz or Peace Colombia.
Yeah.
We've got just about a minute left, but can you sketch out what's anticipated there?
Yeah, I mean, it's just a reflection of how Plan Colombia has been so dynamic. It's shifted and changed over time, meeting the needs of the Colombians and demands of the Colombians. And in this case, with Peace Colombia, it's exactly that. It's looking at where can the United States help in the implementation of a peace process, a peace agreement. And that's not going to be cheap, and it's not going to be easy.
Well, and is it fair to characterize it as one of the chief concerns is addressing a potential vacuum once FARC is completely demobilized and isn't there anymore? Right. What replaces it?
Yeah, I mean that's part of it. It's one of the focus areas is consolidating the gains, the security gains that the Colombian government has made up until now, which have been substantial, and trying to expand it. It's also trying to help with economic development. So creating opportunities for those guerrillas who are demobilizing and trying to re-enter civilian life. Helping us the United States can help the Colombian government sort of bolster that aspect of the country's economy, and just being there as a partner and listening and being flexible. I mean, that's kind of been the key ingredient in Plan Colombia's success. It's Colombian led, and the U.S. supports where we can make a difference.
Well, I guess we'll have to leave it there. Thank you for coming home and talking to us, to our viewers. We'll see you again soon on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website.